Well, maybe you remember that 80s classic Big. In the movie, a young boy named Josh Baskin, sick of being bullied by bigger kids, he goes to an amusement park and he makes a wish that he could be big and not little. And he grows up and becomes a grown-up overnight. Now, at first, he finds being a grown-up is cool. I mean, he gets his own apartment, he gets a girl. But slowly, he becomes a busy grown-up with a job and responsibilities. Now, this is much to the disappointment of his best friend, Billy. Billy feels himself getting elbowed out of Josh's life, and he tells him as much in that scene in his office. Josh takes it to heart, realizing that he actually likes having a best friend more than he does having adult responsibilities. So he goes back to the amusement park and asks if his wish can be unmade, and he becomes little again. Now, I like the scene from that movie because it's actually such a common experience. So many people grow up into adulthood and find themselves unable to maintain relationships. In fact, social scientists say that when people hit their 20s, they lose a significant percentage of their friends. They get married or they get a job, and they lose the energy or the time to maintain what was once a very rich network of relationships. Now, this is understandable, but it actually is a little bit sad to think that this is what adulthood does. Adulthood makes it hard to maintain friendships. I mean, how many of us, due to being grown-ups, have lost track of people that we swore we would never lose track of? How many of us are reluctant to reach out to others because we just don't have time to maintain those relationships anyway? I mean, anybody we meet, they're probably going to move on, they're probably going to leave the church, they're probably not going to like us, so, what's the point? Making friends is hard, especially as we grow older, but it never stops being important to have friends, no matter how busy or old you are. And that's what we're talking about this morning, and why we're talking about it. We started a series last week, a new series called Making Room, and the series is all about how our lives get filled up with lots of things, activities, commitments, obligations, and the important things sort of get crowded out of our lives and how we need to work really hard to fit in the important things in our lives. And we started last week by talking about one of the most important things that we need to make room for in our lives, and that's you. I mean, we need to make room for you. That's why we moved into this building. That's why we left our crowded little building over a few blocks away. We wanted to make room for you so that you could have the chance to learn about the love of God for you. But there's lots of important things that get crowded out of our lives and lots of things we need to make room for. And that's what we're going to spend the rest of the series talking about, one by one. And this morning, we're going to talk about making room for others. Community gets crowded out of our lives, and we need to make room for other people. We need to make room for friends. Now, hopefully you know this, but human beings were created to live in relationship with others. We are created social animals, intended to do life together. In the Garden of Eden, God created Adam, but when he looked down and saw Adam all alone, he said, wow, I've done so many good things on planet Earth, but this is not good. It is not good for man to be alone. So God made a suitable helper for him, the woman, Eve. We were made to live in a relationship with other people. It's not good if we don't. It's one of our basic needs to not be alone. Abraham Maslow, the great psychologist, put the need for love and belonging number 3 in his hierarchy of needs, just after physical and safety needs. In fact, some scientists believe that our need for love and belonging are even greater than our need for physical needs for food and safety. Maybe you've heard, for example, of the famous Harry Harlow experiments way back in the 1950s. Harlow was a psychologist who wanted to test the importance of attachment early in life. So he took newborn rhesus monkeys away from their mothers, and he put them in a room with 2 surrogate mothers, each equipped to dispense milk. Now, one of the milk dispensing mother figures was just a big wire frame. The other was a wire frame covered in soft fur, made to look like an actual monkey. Now, obviously, the baby monkeys preferred receiving milk from the mother with the soft fur. But here's the rub. Even when the milk was removed from the furry mother, the babies still preferred the furry mother over the wire mesh mother who could give them milk. They preferred to snuggle with the furry mother even if it meant going hungry. We were made to crave nurture. We were made to crave relationships, acceptance, love, maybe even more than food. Besides which, people who live in relationships with others live happier and healthier lives. Writer and preacher John Ortberg tells of an experiment called the Alameda County Study. In the experiment, Harvard researchers followed 7,000 people in Alameda County over 9 years, and they found that the most isolated people were 3 times as likely to die than those with healthy relational connections. People with bad health habits like smoking and obesity and alcohol use, but strong relationships, lived significantly longer than those who lived alone but had healthy personal habits. In other words, according to Ortberg, it's better to eat Twinkies with friends than broccoli alone. And if that's true, imagine how much healthier it would be to eat broccoli with friends, but who really wants to get together to do that? So we were made to live in relationship with other people. And I don't just mean live in relationship with other people. I mean live in healthy relationship with other people. We were made to live in relationship with other people in healthy ways. Life-giving relationships, relationships with healthy boundaries and mutual concern and compassion and authenticity and intimacy. We were designed to live in relationship like that. Now, even though we were created to live in life-giving relationships like these, though, that doesn't mean we do. Building life-giving relationships is hard. It takes work. Plus, God created Adam and Eve and you and I to not be alone, but that was before sin entered the world. When Adam and Eve disobeyed God and ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the garden, they introduced sin and shame into the world. They introduced sin and shame into community, into relationships, into our families and friendships. The author of Genesis writes that after they ate from the tree, their eyes were opened and they were both ashamed, so they hid. They passed down this shame to their children, who passed it down to their children, who passed it down to their children, who passed it down to us. So our ability to relate to other people in healthy ways became hindered. And instead of filling up our lives with healthy relationships with other people, we started filling up our lives with other things. What other things? Well, things like isolation. Given the difficulty of relationships and our sense of personal shame, it became easier to live by ourselves than to do the hard work of relating to others. It became easier to live in isolation. And I'm not talking about the occasional alone personal quiet time. It's good to have alone time. You can even live by yourself and be a perfectly happy person. There are some perfectly happy loners in the world. I am one of them. Any other perfectly happy loners out there? Yes, perfectly happy loners, unite. No, I'm not talking about, the occasional alone time. I'm talking about something worse. I'm talking about isolation, emotional isolation. I'm talking about a perpetual, unshakable loneliness. A surprisingly high number of people in the world are perpetually and depressingly lonely. One survey that I read this week said that almost 90% of adult men in the United States lack a true friend. Almost 90% of adult men in the United States lack a true friend. And I'm not talking about a drinking buddy or a cubicle mate. I'm talking about a genuine true friend. Mother Teresa said loneliness is the leprosy of modern society. People walk around feeling lonely, but nobody ever wants to discuss it. Nobody wants to touch it. But it is a problem, loneliness and isolation. People can get so busy and even spend lots of time together with lots of people, but still be lonely. I know a lot of incredibly social people who are actually some of the loneliest people I know. I even know lots of people who are lonely married people. They've spent decades feeling lonely in what looks like a perfectly healthy marriage. They go on dates with their spouse, they talk with their spouse, they have sex with their spouse, they just don't know their spouse. Because authentic relationships are hard, they get crowded out of our lives, and we replace them with isolation. We replace them with nothing, really. But we also replace authentic relationships with dysfunction. Instead of enjoying life-giving, healthy relationships, we get stuck in exhausting, unhealthy, dysfunctional relationships. Relationships where just something is not quite working right. That's what it means to be a dysfunctional relationship, a relationship that's just not quite working right. These relationships can take the form of codependent relationships, where two people need each other just a little bit too much. That's what a codependent relationship is. Two people who need each other just a little bit too much. Or they can be one-way relationships, in which a relationship is all about what you expect me to do for you, or if we're honest, all about what I expect you to do for me. Or our relationships can become tiptoe relationships, in which you just can't talk about certain things. Like the most important things you need to talk about, you just can't talk about those things because it's just going to set somebody off. You can't talk about your wife's self-esteem problem. You can't talk about your husband's pornography problem. You can't talk about your son's alcoholism. You can't talk about your friend's relational problems. You can't talk about those things because it turns into World War III. That's dysfunction. Instead of living in life-giving relationship with other people, we fill our lives with dysfunction. And while healthy relationships give us life, dysfunctional relationships drain it right out of us. You know what that's like. Something else we fill our lives with instead of life-giving relationships is earthly accomplishments. We fill our lives with things that make us feel important, but don't really help us grow as human beings. We fill our lives with things that are relatively easier to succeed at compared to relationships. I know a lot of very professionally successful people who are very good at business and very good at their trade, but they have no significant, meaningful relationships because those are much harder than succeeding at relationships, than succeeding at work. And what does it matter if you're all the success in the world, but you don't have anybody to share that with? As the author writes in the book of Ecclesiastes, again, I saw something meaningless under the sun. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil, yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling, he asked. And why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? This too is meaningless, a miserable business. What does it matter if you're a success in whatever line of work you're in if you don't have anybody to share it with? So this is all a problem. God created us to live in life-giving relationships with other people. That's where we're at our best. That's where we discover who we really are. That's where we discover God the most. But sin in the world makes those kind of relationships hard. So instead of pursuing life-giving relationships with others, our lives get filled up with other things: isolation, dysfunction, earthly accomplishments, and we're worse for it. So then what do? What is there to do? What can we do to fix this? How do you make room for others? Well, there's this little book called the All Better Book. Maybe you've heard about it. In which elementary school children are asked to solve some of the world's most complicated problems, like global warming, and all sorts of addictions and stuff like that. Now, not that kids have the answers to these questions, but it is amusing to ask them. And one of the questions in the All Better Book pertains to this. The kids are asked this question: with billions of people in the world, someone should be able to figure out a system where no one is lonely. What do you suggest? The answers are interesting. Kalani, age 8, said, for example, people should find lonely people and ask their name and address. Then ask people who aren't lonely their name and address. When you have an even amount of each, assign lonely and not lonely people together in the newspaper. That's a pretty good idea. Max, age 9, says this: make food that talks to you when you eat. For instance, it would say, how are you doing? And what happened to you today? Sounds like a good idea to me. Matt, age 8, says, we could get people a pet or a husband or a wife and take them places. I don't think getting people a spouse is quite as simple as getting them a pet. Unless there's a husband smart or a wife smart out there that I'm not aware of. Get it? Pet smart, husband, get it, thank you. But here's what Brian said. This one actually breaks your heart. He says this: sing a song, stomp your feet, read a book. Sometimes I think no one loves me, so I do one of those. What are you doing, Brian? Nothing. All better. So maybe that's the answer to our relational problem: singing songs, reading books, stomping feet. Now, nothing against foot stomping, but the real solution to our relational difficulties is unfortunately nothing we can do. Far more important than anything we can do is what God can do. We, in general, are not the solution to our problems. God is. In fact, more important than anything God can do is what God has already done. One of the reasons Jesus came to earth 2,000 years ago was to restore our ability to live in healthy relationship with other people. And our best chance at filling our lives up with healthy relationships is to work with God as He works to do the same in our lives, which raises a very important question. What did God do to help restore our ability to connect relationally with others? What did God do to help restore our ability to connect relationally with others? And what can we do to cooperate with Him? Well, I see a few things God has done to restore our ability to connect with others. First, God came to show us true friendship. God came to earth to show us true friendship. Our ability to live in genuine relationship with others has been seriously marred by sin. We don't know how to do it. If given the chance to make a good friend, most of us usually screw it up. On the night before Thanksgiving, for example, my family watched one of my favorite all-time movies. It's Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. I don't know if anybody else loves that movie as much as I do. One of my favorite movies of all time. It is the perfect holiday buddy movie. It's funny, it's sweet, it's beautiful, it's a classic. And it's all about this. It's all about two guys who just do not know how to be friends to each other. Deep down, they're both so lonely, though. I mean, John Candy is this pathetic, depressing shower curtain ring salesperson who lives on the road and has no family to go home to. And Steve Martin is this arrogant, busy ad executive who knows nothing about genuine connection. And here's the thing, deep down, they're both incredibly lonely. They don't even know how lonely they are, but they don't know what to do about it. That's why Jesus came to earth, to help us know what to do about it. He came to show us true friendship. He did so by gathering his little group of disciples together and being their friends so that they could demonstrate this sort of friendship to others. As he tells them in the Gospel of John, I no longer call you servants because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I call you friends. Imagine the God of the universe coming to earth and being friends with us. Jesus has a lot to teach us about friendship, how to make and keep them. I mean, if you're not a very good friend to people, read the Gospels. Study the friendship techniques of Jesus. I mean, notice how positive and genuine Jesus was with his friends. He encouraged them. He was honest with them. He didn't overwhelm them with sarcasm like I do my friends. Notice how intentional Jesus was with his friends. He prioritized his friends. He cultivated these relationships. There were so many things Jesus could have done while on planet Earth, and he prioritized spending time with his friends. He didn't go write any books or anything. He didn't start a blog. He spent time with his friends. And notice how much time Jesus spends with his friends. I mean, in the Gospels, Jesus goes off by himself like 3 times. I mean, meaningful, significant times, but Jesus goes off by himself like 3 times. The rest of the time, he's with his friends. And even on the 3rd time when he goes off by himself, he takes some of his friends with him so he doesn't get lonely. The 3rd time when Jesus goes off by himself, he takes some of his friends with him so he doesn't get lonely, and they keep falling asleep. A lot of us want meaningful, life-changing friendships and relationships. Well, we say we do. I should clarify. We say we want meaningful, life-changing friendships and relationships, but we don't want to invest the time it takes to cultivate them. That's just not going to work. The older I get, I can't believe I'm saying things like the older I get, but the older I get, when I was a young man, I was just too busy to cultivate old relationships and old friendships. And the older I get, the more precious those are to me. And if someone comes across Facebook or sends me a message or sends me an email or wants to talk on the phone, I'm like, absolutely, right now. Because that's the stuff of life. So that's one of the ways that God restores our ability to enjoy life-sustaining relationships, by showing us what they look like, by demonstrating genuine friendship in the life of Jesus. Something else God does is this. God gives us the church. The church is the gathering of God's people. The church is where we can discover real friendship with God and with each other. Now, I know that churches are not known to be the friendliest places. I know churches can be places of real hatred and discrimination and judgmentalism. Maybe you've heard the story told by Philip Yancey in his book, What's So Amazing About Grace? It's a little graphic, but you all are adults. According to Yancey, a friend of him told him this story. A prostitute came to me in wretched straits, homeless, sick, unable to buy food for her 2-year-old daughter. Through sobs and tears, she told me she had been renting out her daughter, 2 years old, to men interested in kinky sex. She made more renting out her daughter for an hour than she could earn on her own in a night. She had to do it, she said, to support her own drug habit. I could hardly bear hearing her sordid story. At last, I asked if she had ever thought of going to a church for help. I will never forget the look of pure, naive shock that crossed her face. "Church!" she cried. "Why would I ever go there? I already feel terrible about myself. They're just going to make me feel worse." To the world, this is what the church represents: a place of judgmentalism and rejection. But that was definitely not the idea. When Jesus instituted the church, he meant the church to be a place of love and grace and fellowship, a garden where we could enjoy the fellowship with each other that was lost in the fall. In the book of Acts, Luke gives us a picture of the church in this regard. It was the church as the church was meant to be. As he writes, in those days they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. The church is God's gift to us where we can enjoy friendship and fellowship with others. That's what the church is, a place to make friends. It's why the Quaker church doesn't even call themselves a church or a denomination. Have you ever heard about the Quakers? The Quakers are a Christian denomination, but they don't even call themselves a church. They don't even call themselves a denomination. They call themselves the Society of Friends, because they understand that it's exactly what the church is. The church is a place where you make friends. It is my deepest hope and deepest desire that you who are visiting us this morning at Rooftop, or you who have been visiting us over the past couple months, can find friends here. That's one of the reasons why we came here. I know you need friends, and I know there's lots of people here that are happy to get to know you. Maybe you'll get together, a lot easier than setting it up in a newspaper. And I believe this is possible. I mean, hundreds of people have found lifelong and life-giving friendships here at Rooftop, whether in small groups or going down to Mexico or working with the homeless or serving on a service committee or just meeting for coffee. But I want to make sure that you understand that it doesn't just happen. It takes work. It takes years of work sometimes. It can take repeated attempts. I mean, we're all a bunch of sinners who continue to disappoint and hurt each other. I mean, if you sign up for one small group that doesn't really work, well, try another one. If that doesn't really work, try another one. If you meet someone that's not really clicking, try somebody else. If that doesn't work, try somebody else, or maybe try a little bit harder. I know community is hard, believe me, but it can happen. I mean, I am the most awkward, sensitive, thin-skinned, easily rejected person in this church. I have felt more judged and rejected at this church than anybody here, without a doubt. It's just an occupational hazard. But I have found my spiritual family here. My best friends in the world are in this church because I didn't give up on the church, because I believe in the church, because it's why God gave it to us. To make friends, lifelong, life-changing relationships. That's what God did to restore our ability to connect with other people. He shows us true friendship in Jesus, and he gives us the church. And lastly, he does this, maybe most importantly. He takes away our guilt and shame. He takes away our guilt and shame. When Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, it filled them with shame and guilt. They could not believe they had so disobeyed God. Their eyes were opened by that fruit, and they realized they were naked, and they were embarrassed by it. So they ran and they hid. They hid from God. They hid from each other. And like I said, this sense of shame and embarrassment was passed down to their children, who passed it down to their children, who passed it down to their children, who passed it down to us. And it infects the world in which we live. And this sense of shame and guilt is the biggest impediment to genuine relationships with other people. We don't think we're good enough for people to want to get to know us. We don't think people will want to be our friend. We don't think people could forgive us for the terrible things we've done. So, why try? This is also why Jesus came. He came to restore our ability to relate to God and to relate to each other. And to do that, he died on the cross for our sins. He took on himself the punishment I deserve for my crimes. In so doing, he took my guilt and shame away. I don't need to walk around feeling guilty or ashamed and terrible for all the ugly things I've ever done or said, and I've done a lot against God and others. As the author of Hebrews writes, since we have been forgiven of our sins, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience and having our bodies washed with pure water. And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. Let us not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. The author's point here is that since we have been forgiven by God, we can now live in authentic relationships with others. There's no guilt, there's no shame keeping us from being honest with others, loving others, being accepted by others, meeting continually with others. Every terrible thing I've ever said or done to my wife has been permanently, eternally wiped from the mind of God. And there's no reason that Michelle and I can't have a happy, long-lasting, life-changing relationship. Every terrible thing I've ever said or done to you or anybody on planet Earth has been permanently, eternally wiped from the mind of God, and there's no reason that I can't have an eternally happy, long-lasting, life-changing relationship with anybody on planet Earth. Our ability to live in relationships with others depends on our ability to live in relationship with God. But this leads to a very important question. How is your relationship with God? We've been talking about the importance of making room for others this morning, but that all depends on the role God has in your life. You might want to make room for friends, but the surest way to do that is to make room for God. Have you made room for God in your life? Have you made room for His forgiveness? Have you made room for His grace? Have you made room for His truth? Have you made room for His mercy? Have you been baptized as a symbol of God's grace in your life? That's what we do here at Rooftop. We help restore people to God. And in so doing, we restore people to one another. If you want to be restored to God, let us know. We can help you do that. Just fill out your blue info card. Jeremy will set up some time to talk more. If you're not ready for that, though, I understand. We're pushy here at Rooftop. We're not psycho about it. We know you might need some time. But just so you know, that's the way forward. Your best shot at making true and lasting friendships in life is to be restored to God. Your best shot at being connected to other people here at Rooftop is getting connected to God. Your best shot at enjoying the sort of life-giving relationships you are made for is to have your sins forgiven by the greatest friend you will ever know. Make room for God. He'll help you make room for others. Let's pray.